It was the deadliest pandemic in human history. It killed more people than the Great War that was raging alongside it. It infected 1/3 of the entire human population on Earth. And yet today, it is largely forgotten. This is the story of the 1918 Spanish flu, a disease that arrived on the heels of victory, turning celebrations into funerals and joy into unimaginable grief. This is the story of a killer that had no face, no enemy to fight, and no mercy to give. The name itself is a lie. It was not Spanish. In fact, Spain was one of the last places it struck with any real force. The reason it became known as the Spanish flu is one of history's cruel ironies. During the First World War, newspapers in countries like Britain, France, Germany, and the United States were heavily censored. They were forbidden from publishing anything that might damage morale, including news of a deadly disease sweeping through their military camps. But Spain was neutral. Its press was free. And when the flu arrived there in May 1918, including infecting King Alfonso XIII himself, Spanish newspapers reported it openly. The rest of the world, reading these reports, assumed the disease had originated in Spain. They called it the Spanish flu. In Spain, they called it the French flu. Everyone blamed someone else. The truth was far more unsettling. This virus had no single birthplace. It seemed to erupt almost simultaneously across the globe. The earliest confirmed cases appeared in March 1918 at a military camp in Haskell County, Kansas. A cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary with a cough, fever, and headache. Within weeks, hundreds of soldiers at nearby Camp Funston were sick. From there, the virus crossed the Atlantic with American troops heading to the trenches of Europe. But was Kansas truly the beginning? Some historians believe it may have started in China, carried across the world by laborers working in French army camps. Others point to the battlefields of France themselves. The truth is, we may never know. What we do know is that by April 1918, the flu had reached France, Germany, and Britain. Among the soldiers who fell ill was a young private whose letters home would later become a haunting testament to the pandemic's early days. He wrote to his brother, "I am sick with the flu. It feels like nothing I have ever had before. The fever burns, and then the chills shake me to my bones." He survived. Many others did not. But this first wave was deceptive. It seemed mild, almost ordinary. The real horror was yet to come. The first wave of the pandemic, in the spring of 1918, was comparatively mild. It swept through military camps and cities with the symptoms of a normal seasonal flu: fever, body aches, sore throat, a dry cough. People recovered after a few days. Doctors were not overly concerned. The world was focused on the war, on the millions of young men dying in the trenches of France. The flu was an inconvenience, a distraction. No one realized they were watching the opening act of a global catastrophe. But in the trenches of the Western Front, something different was happening. The cramped, unsanitary conditions were the perfect breeding ground for the virus. Soldiers weakened by months of warfare, exposure to poison gas, and poor nutrition were uniquely vulnerable. The flu spread like wildfire through the ranks. In some units, up to 80% of soldiers fell ill. The military authorities did their best to hide the extent of the outbreak. After all, how could they tell the public that their sons were dying not from German bullets, but from a cough? The warring nations had a problem. News of a devastating epidemic sweeping through their armies would be catastrophic for morale, so they simply did not report it. British newspapers were forbidden from mentioning the flu. French physicians were ordered to refer to it only as Disease 11. The American press downplayed the outbreak. The world was kept in the dark. Only Spain, neutral and free, told the truth. And for that honesty, they were forever branded with the disease's name. And then, in the late summer of 1918, the virus mutated. What emerged was something the world had never seen before. The second wave was not merely worse than the first, it was a different beast entirely. The flu began killing healthy young adults in their 20s and 30s, people in the prime of their lives with the strongest immune systems, and it killed them with terrifying speed. Some victims would go to bed feeling fine and be dead by morning. The virus caused their own immune systems to overreact, flooding their lungs with fluid until they essentially drowned. The symptoms were unlike anything doctors had ever witnessed. Victims suffered from a condition called heliotrope cyanosis, a creeping blue-black discoloration that started in the fingertips, the ears, the nose, and the lips. As the disease progressed, the skin would turn completely black. Witnesses described it as horrifying. One survivor wrote, "The bodies changed color so quickly after death, they had to be screwed down to await burial. The undertakers couldn't make coffins fast enough, let alone polish them. Corpses piled up in morgues and funeral homes. The smell of death was indescribable." Nowhere was the horror more evident than in Philadelphia. In September 1918, the city's public health officials made a catastrophic error. They allowed a massive Liberty Loan parade to proceed, gathering hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Within 72 hours, every single hospital bed in the city was full. Within a week, over 10,000 people were dead. The daily death toll from influenza alone exceeded the city's average weekly death toll from all causes. Corpses lay in the streets, morgues overflowed, families buried their loved ones in mass graves. The undertakers worked from dawn until dusk, 7 days a week. Graves were dug to hold multiple bodies, sometimes entire families buried together. One 9-year-old girl from Coventry wrote decades later about losing her 35-year-old mother and 7-year-old sister just 2 days apart. They were buried in a double funeral on November 11, 1918, the very day the First World War ended. "It caused quite a sensation," she wrote, "having to have a double funeral on the very day the war ended." As the church bells rang in celebration of peace, her family's funeral procession passed silently through the streets. The pandemic was truly global. It reached the remote islands of the Pacific. It devastated indigenous communities in Alaska. It swept through the gold mines of South Africa and the shrine city of Mashhad in Persia. Africa and Asia suffered disproportionately. More Kenyans died than Scots, more Indonesians than Dutch. The virus did not care about borders, politics, or class. It infected the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless. In the United States alone, over 600,000 people died, 5 times the number of American soldiers killed in the war. In some places, the destruction was almost total. In the remote Inuit villages of Alaska, the flu arrived with a single traveler. Within days, entire communities were wiped out. One village lost 72 out of 80 residents. The bodies were found frozen in their homes the following spring. There was no one left to bury them. In the Canadian Arctic, the epidemic claimed so many lives that whole families perished together. One nurse's diary from Australia recorded the devastating losses with just 2 words: "Tommy died." And then, the war ended. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The world celebrated. But for millions of families, there was nothing to celebrate. The war had taken their sons, their husbands, their fathers, and now the flu was taking their wives, their mothers, their daughters. You've got harrowing stories of soldiers who'd survived the war, one historian noted. They're on their troop ship on their way home, and they get a letter to say that their wives died. Celebration collided with grief on a scale the world had never seen. The pandemic left behind a generation of survivors marked by loss. One man from Leicester, the son of a Baptist minister, wrote of his father sleeping in the cemetery chapel while he conducted funerals from dawn until dusk. He was terrified of taking the virus home to his wife and 8 children. They were the lucky ones. They survived. But Leicester was hit especially hard. More people died there in 1918 than babies were born. About 1 in every 4 deaths in the city that year was attributed to influenza. But the flu did not only kill, it also broke minds. Some victims suffered from a psychosis that could lead to murder and suicide. The trauma of watching loved ones die in agony, of seeing bodies turn black, of being unable to bury the dead, it left deep psychological scars. The pandemic was not just a medical catastrophe, it was a collective trauma that a generation carried silently. And then, as quickly as it had come, the virus began to fade. By the spring of 1920, the pandemic was over, but its legacy would endure. In the end, the Spanish flu infected an estimated 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population. It killed between 50 and 100 million people. By comparison, the First World War claimed approximately 20 million lives. The pandemic was the second deadliest plague in human history, surpassed only by the Black Death of the 1300s. And yet today, it is barely a footnote in most history textbooks. Why? Perhaps because the pandemic was overshadowed by the war. Perhaps because it had no single hero, no decisive battle, no clear beginning or end. Perhaps because the dead were buried in mass graves, and the living wanted nothing more than to move on. The historian Laura Spinney wrote that the pandemic is remembered not as a collective catastrophe, but as small, personal tragedies. A mother lost here, a father lost there, a sister, a brother, a child. Millions of individual griefs, too numerous and too painful to be woven into a single narrative. The Spanish flu was not a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of human vulnerability. It showed us that in the face of an invisible enemy, all our armies, all our technology, all our pride count for nothing. It showed us that we are all connected, that a virus in Kansas can kill a mother in Coventry, a soldier in France, a child in Alaska. And it showed us that we forget at our own peril, because the next pandemic is not a question of if, it is only a question of when.